Good morning. I'd like to welcome you back again to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. And this week we have been in Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 56. Part of this text that we're looking at is really drifting back into last week, and then we're kind of putting these together because the theme is the same. And the topic we've been addressing is the miracle of Christ's church. And what we've been examining this week is how the fact that the church continues to grow and it is preserved from generation to generation, and the fact that God works through such flawed instruments yet continues to accomplish his work is a tremendous testimony to the miraculous nature of Christ building the church. And I want to remind you again of what Jesus says in Matthew when Peter made that great statement, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Jesus has been building his church for the last 2,000 years. He continues to build his church in our generation, and he will continue to build his church until the day that he comes again to take his church to be with him. And so let's turn again to Luke chapter 9. We're looking at verses 46 through 56, and we're examining how Christ dealt with the disciples in their very flawed perspective. Here's what it says, verse 46. "Then there arose a reasoning among them, which of them should be the greatest. And Jesus, perceiving the thought of their heart, took a child, and set him by him, and said unto them, Whosoever shall receive this child in my name receiveth me. Whosoever shall receive me receiveth him that sent me. For he that is least among you all, the same shall be great. And John answering said, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him, because he followeth not with us. Jesus said unto him, Forbid him not, for he that is not against us is for us. It came to pass, when the time was come, that he should have received up him, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, and sent messengers before his face, and they went and entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. They did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? And he turned to rebuke them and said, Ye know not of what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went to another village. Now, if you can remember back to yesterday, we were talking about the fact that the disciples had a very flawed perspective. Their perspective was, at the root, it was proud. It was self-centered. And we saw that there were several different ways that that pride and that selfish ambition began to manifest itself in the way that they ministered. We saw a self-reliance. We saw the fact that the disciples had contention amongst themselves. We saw that they were trying to control everybody rather than recognizing that they were peers who were under the authority of Christ. They saw themselves as the ones who were in charge. Well, what I'd like us to notice in this particular setting is not just the disciples' flawed perspective, but the way that Christ met them in their flawed perspective, the way that he dealt with them in their flawed perspective. I think a lot of times as Christians, it's easy for us to look at people who clearly do have problems in the way that they're looking at things, and we can sometimes just write them off. We can act as if there's no way that God could use this person. We act as if this person maybe is never going to grow. And I think it's important for us to notice the way that Jesus dealt with these people, because it is a pattern that really we need to follow ourselves. It should shape our perspective. And so what we're going to look at this morning is what a healthy perspective actually looks like. How does someone work with others whose perspective needs to be challenged? It needs to be shaped. It needs to mature. Christ is the perfect example of this. Well, what we're going to see in these verses is that there are two things that Christ did. The first is that he confronts and corrects the wrong perspective. Now, there is a way that he does it that is very important. The second thing we're going to notice, though, is that though he corrects it and he confronts it, he doesn't write the disciples off. He doesn't, kick them out of the group that's going to represent him to the nations. What Jesus does is he works through them where they are, and they grow and they mature in the process. And God works despite their flaws. God works through their strengths. He does that. We see it clearly in the text. So first of all, notice verse 40, we see that Christ sighs in frustration at what he sees and what he hears. He says, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and suffer you?" It's almost as if Christ laments that the disciples are in such a mindset. The second thing that he does is he brings an illustration. I've thought about this a little bit because I've had some time to process this. Rather than Jesus speaking directly to the disciples and saying, "Hey, you guys are proud and you need to stop," he pulls a child and he sits the child down beside him and he says to them, "If this child is received by someone in my name, they've received me." This is what Jesus is doing. He's giving them an illustration to make them think. It's his own way of saying, listen, it's not the power in you, and it's not the wisdom in you, and it's not the strength in you that has caused me to call you and caused me to work through you. I'm calling you and I'm working through you by grace alone. I could choose a child. I can choose you. He even says, I've humbled myself because I come in the name of the Father. What's Jesus doing? Well, he is confronting their pride with an illustration. He is helping them to see it, not just hear it. And in many ways, he is softening the confrontational element, yet still getting the point across. We see that here. But then we move to verse 50, and we see that in that particular confrontation, it says, Jesus says the following, "Forbid him not. He that is not against us is for us." So in the first example, he sighs. In the second example, he gives an illustration. In the third example, he teaches them. He says, don't forbid this person. If he's not against us, then he's for us. That means that Jesus is shaping their perspective. He is teaching them. He's explaining to them that the way that they're seeing this is wrong, and he's giving them the correct understanding of how to look at it. But then in the fourth example, it's actually got a little bit different sense to it. In verse 56, he says, he turned, he rebuked them and said, "Ye know not of what spirit ye are of. The Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." So in one sense, he sighs. In another, he corrects through illustration. In another, he teaches. In the last example, what does he do? He rebukes and he reminds. In other words, Jesus is not just ignoring their flawed perspective, he's addressing the flawed perspective, but he knows in each individual situation what is the best way to address the issue, to correct the disciples' wrong thinking, so that they can get where they need to be and he can continue to work through them. But here's the piece that I want to really take away from this. Not just how Jesus deals with them, but how he works through them. In all of these examples, what we see is that Christ is patient. He suffers long with these disciples. In fact, as we read the rest of the book of Luke, and then we move into the book of Acts, what we're going to see is that Jesus didn't write off these disciples. He didn't say, disqualified, you're done. No, what does he do? He continues to work in them and through them. And folks, this is how God works with us too. Think about something as simple as raising our children. How many of us, when we start raising our children, have absolutely no clue what we're doing? Yet God gives us these children. And through the process of raising our kids, God uses the ministry of working with our children to mature us and to mold us and to shape us and to confront us. And so what God does is he works both in us and through us through this process. I think about somebody who goes into ministry, especially someone like a missionary. When a missionary goes to the field, they may go through some great training, but the fact is that there's no training for ministry on a foreign field like being on a foreign field. And a missionary has to learn really through the difficulties, and God works both in them and through them. When we think about our marriages, when we get married, we can go through pre-marriage counseling, and there's a lot that a pastor can talk to us about, and we're raised in our homes and we're learning things in our homes, but there's no training in marriage like being married. That's just a simple fact. And so many things in life, we learn them as we go through them. In other words, God does not just say, okay, when you become the perfect minister, that's when I start working through you. When you become the perfect parent, that's when I'll give you the children. When you become the perfect man or woman, that's when I'll let you get married and give you a spouse. God brings us to that point in life by his grace. He sustains us through that, and he both works in us and through us. And that's what we see in this passage of Scripture. That's really what makes the church such a miraculous thing, because God is working through very flawed people to give the gospel, to make disciples, to guide and mentor and shepherd the church. In other words, the glory doesn't really go to those people because they're in the midst of a learning process. They're growing themselves. No, all the glory goes to God. The fact that the church is built and sustained and it's passed on from generation to generation, it's all a testimony to God's greatness. And so you say, well, Joel, what's the takeaway? Well, here's the takeaway. Christ is building his church. We should glory in that. He's doing it through us and sometimes despite us. And might I say, extending tremendous grace to us in the process. And so the takeaway is, let's glory in him. Let's feel the tension or the balance of perspective that is both sobered by our immaturity, our lack of wisdom, our lack of strength, our lack of equipping, yet his kindness to work through us and to build us and to shape us, and yes, to allow us to participate in this great work that he's doing. I would say that the takeaway from this text is that we need the balanced perspective that is both sobered by our weakness and limits, but rejoicing in God's grace and his power and his willingness to allow us to be a part of what he's doing. To me, that is the great takeaway of the text in front of us this morning. And so I hope that you're both sobered and encouraged at the same time. If this has been a challenge to you this morning, or if it's encouraged you, please share that. Take a moment to share it with someone who you think could be benefited by it. And Lord willing, tomorrow we're going to continue in this study. Have a blessed day. Bye now.